What point what is your process? How many drafts are you typically going through, and at what point do you start to feel, oh, I've got something here, or is it always kind of a question until readers tell you later?
It is always a question. I mean, to answer that last question first, you never know. You can be out in the world and you're still wondering if anybody will care or if anybody will think it's any good. For myself, I start with a synopsis. I mean, the premise and the idea is always good, but unless I map it out in a 3-act synopsis, then I will probably. I used to try to write without mapping out a synopsis, and I would always get stuck. I would always have an interesting idea, start to write. Well, this was very early on when I was just beginning the process, and I realized pretty quickly that unless I map out some version of a beginning and a middle and an end in a 3-act structure, and I know where it's ultimately hopefully going to go, even though I know it will change a lot along the way, that gives me the security to keep going and to kind of fight my way through a first draft.
So do you know your ending going in then?
I know a version of the ending that will ultimately mutate to some degree. Sometimes it stays pretty close to what I've originally written up in a synopsis, and sometimes I've gone somewhere far afield. I do like to after a book is done, I will entertain myself by going back and looking at the synopsis and seeing how far afield I've gone. And sometimes I've gone into a whole other field, and sometimes I've stayed pretty close. But the idea of not knowing where my characters are going has always scared me, because it's any writer looks for any excuse to procrastinate and to stop. At least I certainly do. And so I don't want to have the excuse of not knowing what's going to happen next as a reason to stop. I want to make sure I eliminate that excuse from my tools of procrastination. And so I will always map out a 3 to 5 page plot summary, and then I wrestle my way through a first draft, knowing it could be terrible because I just want to spit it out on paper. So the first draft for me is the hardest, because even though I do have a synopsis, the storytelling still has to be developed, and creating scenes and propelling the plot along is challenging for me. The voice of the characters I write in has always been a more natural process for me and less difficult than making sure I have plots that are surprising and funny and new, because you could tell yourself that every plot's been written, and you might not be wrong. So to find new ways to tell new stories is always a great challenge. And then I will always I'll immediately dive into a second draft before showing it to anybody, because the first draft is completely unshowable. And then by the time I've written the revision, the first revision, sometimes I'll start showing it to people at that point, an editor or an agent or a trusted family member who reads my stuff sometimes.
You use critique partners still at this point, or is it mostly?
I don't do that. I did have a critique group early on, and which was very valuable. But now I kind of have an unofficial brain trust. One of my kids, my oldest son Charlie, reads everything I write, usually pretty early in the process.
One of the boys for whom the boy who does not read was named.
Yes, absolutely, Charlie, Joe, and Jack. And they've all been they've all been a little bit more willing to read my stuff now than they were at the beginning. But another thing I will do almost always before I show it to anybody is I write on a computer, like most people do. But I'm a big believer that something will look different on a page than it will on a screen. So once I've written a second draft that I feel is semi-acceptable, I will print it out and do a whole revision on a printed manuscript, and I will do it the old-fashioned way by scribbling revisions in the margins and Xing out stuff, and I feel like seeing the printed word on the page, just for some reason, it feels different, and it feels, I can see something in a printed draft that I'm like, how did I think this was good on the screen? And so I will often do that as my third draft, and then start